Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is my podcast. I'm Mason Davis. Today's topic is African Americans and underrepresented sports. Today, I have a special guest, my father.
Thank you for having me on, Mace. I appreciate it. I'm Vernon Davis. I'm your father. Age 46. I graduated from Westchester University, played multiple sports all throughout my lifetime, and played football and lacrosse in college.
Perfect. So, just to start off this podcast, I want to read you a quote from one of the articles I read. The quote is: "Sometimes the playing field itself became another hazard to be negotiated, as evidenced by an on field death of Iowa State's Jack Trice in 1923 and deliberate beatings of other football players." I think this is just important to start off the podcast because it shows the discrimination that African Americans faced in early collegiate sports. Even though there aren't beatings like this anymore, there are still traces of discrimination in today's world. Obviously, our topic today is African Americans and underrepresented sports. Somebody who is African American and played an underrepresented sport of lacrosse, where is any discrimination, traces of discrimination that you faced along the way?
I think the I think the most discrimination probably just takes place amongst people of your own kind, really. So for me, I think the most discrimination I probably received was from other black people who I talk to and don't know about the sport, um, and they have their own questions about it being a part of black culture, and then there's I think discrimination that comes along with that, and there's their kind of like predetermined notions of what that means about you as a person and playing that sport. And then I've also had some stuff on the field. There's been like little stuff on the field. Um, Certainly, like in high school, I had a situation in high school where there was a guy that I was playing against, and he made some comments about me, and it was like racially motivated, and it became a thing. Yeah, it became
Yes.
a thing.
In today's podcast, we're definitely going to touch on how the culture needs to change, and that's very obvious in trying to expand African Americans in underrepresented sports like lacrosse. We'll get into that question. Um, Another hard part in growing lacrosse is the culture around lacrosse and how it's seen to be sort of that rich white kid type of sport. And one quote from the PLO video I watched is Ramar Dennis quoting, "I was extremely uncomfortable. I remember back then a couple of my black classmates saying, 'Why are you playing lacrosse?' I was always so embarrassed, I lied. I just do it to stay in shape." So often I get criticized for playing a sport that doesn't have much media on us, as like football or basketball, and it seems that a certain race has to play a certain sport. Just my question to you is, how do you think that we can shift the culture of people to recognize that not just one sport is for a certain race?
I think it's a tough question, but I think that sport is a part of culture. So I think that in terms of shifting the culture, sports are a part of various cultures. So I do think that lacrosse is, I think about it too, as like a rich white kid sport. And I think a lot of that is about just access. So lacrosse is a sport where, it's traditionally, as it's come up through in a lot of schools, certainly like within the area of Pennsylvania, it's come up through schools in like rich prep schools. And so that's a matter of being a part of that culture. So if you're a part of that culture, then maybe you're more interested in that sport. And if you don't have access to that sport, you're probably not going to play it. It's the same thing where if soccer is a major part of the culture in which you live in, a lot of people are probably going to play soccer. Um, if basketball is very much a part of the culture in which you live in, you're probably going to play basketball. If you're living within a community or a culture where wrestling is very much a part of the culture of where you live, you'll probably end up being a wrestler. So, these different sports for me are about access and exposure. And so I think the one way to just directly answer your question, I think the one way to shift the culture is by presenting and creating access in areas and spaces which you normally wouldn't find it. And some of that right now with lacrosse. Like lacrosse is expensive. Um, a stick can cost more than $200. That's just the stick. Um, then the helmet can cost more than $200. That's just the helmet. The gloves can cost almost $200. So then there's the cleats. So all this equipment and being properly equipped in order to actually play the sport is one thing, and that stuff costs money. So if you think about basketball, you could get you could buy a cheap basketball, at like five and below. And it's not saying that that's the basketball you're always going to play with, but in terms of being like exposed to the sport, you can buy a cheap basketball. You don't necessarily need great basketball shoes. But as far as lacrosse goes, too, even if you buy a stick, you also need to have a good stick to be able to play with. You probably need to be able to have someone that can teach you how to play it properly. And if you don't have a good stick, it's going to be hard to throw the ball, too. So I think there's a lot of different aspects of being able to expose people to the sport.
Yeah, I think that's a huge piece of um, trying to get more African Americans in underrepresented sports. And I think there's this one group I was reading about. I think you definitely know them, but I wanted to get into Harlem lacrosse because
Mm-hmm.
I just think they're doing such a great thing.
Mm-hmm.
I was reading an article by Matthew Gutierrez quoting, "There are no tryouts and cuts. The team's success on the field came almost by accident. The school is the birthplace of Harlem Lacrosse and Leadership, a nonprofit group that began as a way to entice middle school students to stay on track for graduating and going to college. It installs an academic support team within schools and requires students to attend study hall and keep their grades up in order to play. So what touched me the most is it's not about just growing the game, but turning these young teens into men.
Mm-hmm.
Um, do you think more programs like Harlem Lacrosse can eventually reach the point where they're as big as some football or basketball organizations? And what effect do you think these programs like this will have on other underrepresented sports?
So the short answer is yes. I do think it can happen because lacrosse is still like a rapidly growing sport. I think Harlem Lacrosse has done great work, and even along with Harlem Lacrosse, there's been other organizations and kind of smaller groups that have done it. So here in Philadelphia, you had a he's a man now, but you had a young guy early on. He started a program called Leaps, and so Leaps was a program that was working within Philadelphia, trying to expose kids in the inner city to lacrosse. So Johnny Christmas grew up in Lower Marion. Um, his family is like still in the area, and he was a professional lacrosse player. But what he was doing was he was bringing lacrosse to the inner city, and I think that you've been a part of that with me. So even like my team, we kind of put together a lot of equipment and donated it to Leaps, um, and kind of got affiliated with them a little bit. And then there's another program called Road Runners, which is kind of trying to work with all the Philadelphia schools, the Philadelphia high schools, and try to put together like an all-star team and get them exposed to some of these events, like taking them to tournaments, letting them see, all these kids from across the country that are playing lacrosse at a really, really high level. And so I think it is. And then you throw in a really big organization like the PLO, guys like Romar Dennis who are doing it, and one of their kind of platforms and one of the parts of how they're growing um, the league itself is by getting into the communities, immersing these teams within the communities in order to do things with some of the inner city kids. And one of their kind of things that you do, like if you see PLL, you'll see multiple different groups represented with on each team. Like you're never gonna see a PLL team that's just all white guys. You're never going to see it. So you're going to see a lot of different groups represented within these teams. And the diversity on the teams is on purpose. Like there's intentionality behind what they do with that product in terms of trying to present that product to a multitude of people across the country. So, the more people get exposed to it and see the sport and see like how amazing the sport is, how fast it is, kind of, some of the big hits that happen, and how so many different sports translate into lacrosse, like basketball, hockey, football, and obviously just like in general athleticism. I think you'll start to see more groups that are like, hey, this is a cool sport. Like I want to try that. So I
Yeah.
think yes.
Yeah, so I think that perfectly ties into a next piece that I have on media because I think that the Harlem lacrosse growth is so connected to media and how kids nowadays are getting connected through Instagram and different social media platforms. So I was reading through my one article by Akila, and the tennis media is often filled with non African American women. And a study was shown that African American girls with less media representation in a sport results in them less likely to join that sport. So nowadays, media definitely has a huge impact on all people today not being represented, and as a result, a huge gap in what type of race plays what type of sport. So, how do you think African Americans can get more involved in media to promote these less represented sports? And have you seen any ways that it's worked effectively?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to look at with that is so even in education, I talk to people about having mirrors in in the schools. So for my students, having people in the building that look like them is incredibly important for them to be able to connect and relate. And it's not the end all be all, right? But it's something that's valuable. So I think within sport, having people that look like you is important to be like, all right, that's that person that I want to be like. I want to be like that. So it's easier for you to connect with this person that looks like you and saying, like you want to emulate them. You want to be like them. Like they become your hero. Um, so I think it just makes it easier for young people to connect if there are mirrors for them within these sports. So then they would need to see it. So now kind of like you said with Instagram, like media is different for your generation than it was for mine. So social media is this incredibly powerful tool where I think it's a little bit easier for kids to be exposed to some of these different places and spaces around the world that they wouldn't normally have like access to seeing back when I was a kid. But then you still have like these big powerful media agencies like ESPN. So like if ESPN starts showing clips of lacrosse of some of these different people that are doing amazing things in the sport of lacrosse, it's really important. And you also see that what they're doing, even for lacrosse, is also introducing women's lacrosse in conjunction with the PLL. So they're doing that work to not just spread it as like a male sport, but also the PLL is also doing the work to spread it as a female sport as well, which I think is important for the growth of the male sport. To kind of have like that partnership in that way. But I just think that kids need to be able to see it. I think that kids want to look at people that are like them and then practice it and pretend it and play that out. Like especially when they're little. So I think the exposure is a big deal.
Of course, yeah. I mean, I can talk on definitely the effectiveness of Instagram, and one part is definitely Blackster's blog. It's a huge Instagram page,
Mm-hmm.
accumulated probably around 20,000 followers, and this page was all about like uplifting Black lacrosse players, and it was absolutely amazing. Before it got taken down, sadly,
Oh,
but
it got taken down.
yeah,
When did it get taken down? Because
some
like it was just up,
yeah,
right?
some like a lot of white lacrosse players were mad that it got taken down. Or
Mm.
I mean that it was up, like basically like pushing African Americans up. Like they were mad about that. I don't really know why. Couldn't tell you, but I know other teams like Nations United was huge. It's huge in the black community. Everybody wants to play for that team. And then of course the team that me and Sable played for, ETC, majority black players, and that was pretty cool playing with them. Definitely shortcomings there, but it was definitely fun to play there. And then Harlem lacrosse is just a huge piece. I know a lot of Westtown players have come through Harlem lacrosse, so that's always nice. And you were touching on that piece of idolizing people, or sort of idolizing people that um, look like you in the sport. And I know that I got connected through one player that you know, Kobe Smith, through Blacksters blog. I was able to see him play. He looked like me. He played my position, and now he's in the PLL tearing it up. But that just reminds me of this important quote from Kyle Harrison in the PLL video talking
Mm-hmm.
about how his circumstance actually wasn't as difficult as the other players because he said, quote unquote, having a strong father figure that played lacrosse, that was my superhero. Um, so, how important do you think having a strong African American figures in underrepresented sports is?
Well, I think it's everything, and I think what Kyle Harrison's point, and for what it's worth, like just touching on Kyle Harrison, like Kyle Harrison is a guy who I was able to look at and be like, all right, there's other black players, So like when I grew up, there weren't, at least in the area that I was in, there weren't many black players, and my father, even though he grew up on Long Island, interestingly enough, never played lacrosse, so like Long Island, you did have a lot of people of all different races and colors that were playing like playing lacrosse in Long Island and New York and Baltimore um, back then. Not so much Pennsylvania, but it was interesting. Like my father grew up on Long Island and never played lacrosse, but I think Kyle Harrison was a guy who I was able to look at and be like, yo, there's other black players, and I didn't feel as like awkward. Like it didn't feel as weird, but you know if at least in my age, like if I would go to tournaments and I would go to these different things, and it was rare to see other black players on the field, and so I think having people that you can look at, again, like that's that whole notion of the mirror. Like if you can have people that you look at and be like, yeah, like that's normal, so then you want to do it. Or if there's someone that you really wish to emulate, then it makes it easier to kind of connect with them and then connect with the sport, and then that way you kind of build the culture out. So I think the more you have a person like Kyle Harrison that can influence like hundreds of young black kids, then all of a sudden those hundreds of black kids, maybe some other kids come up, and then now all of a sudden maybe 10 of them like make it and become really popular. Then those 10 can really motivate and inspire like another hundreds of kids, and then it could work exponentially. So um, yeah, I guess that's my answer. I guess that's kind of what I think about when I'm thinking about some of these strong figures to emulate and to look up to.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's been always easy for me in my career because I grew up watching you play lacrosse all the time. So it was like I always had that, and that was always really cool. And then even today, we're still playing with you, even though you're washed.
Ouch.
But
Getting
we,
old.
we still play with you, and that's always fun. And but
I think
that
Sabo was the only person that stripped me last night, though, on some real stuff.
oh okay, all right.
I'm
Well,
just saying.
speaking of
It
Af-
wasn't you.
okay,
It wasn't you.
all right. Well, speaking
Yeah.
on African Americans and playing together, in the PLL video, Nakai Montgomery, as you know,
Mm-hmm.
he was talking about how he grew up in an all black elementary school.
Yeah.
And he was just talking on racism at the time, and so he said, quote unquote, racism is just ignorance, and he was talking about his time together with his team, and how, but we just went through it together, and we were just doing it together and having fun, and I just thought this was just super cool, and Nakai was just talking about how they just came together and just that theme of like resilience and just helped him shape him as a man today. So, how do you think having that strong upbringing in an underrepresented sport helps grow the lacrosse community? And do you think there's any important African Americans are exposed to underrepresented sports during their upbringing, like that they're exposed younger?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, I think some of that stuff is around like ego, right? And so for me, sport was always an outlet. So let me say that, like, sport was always an outlet. Like for me, I played pretty much every sport. Like I could pretty much play every sport, like you name it, and I probably wanted to play it. So I was always incredibly competitive. So whatever I grew up as a gymnast, which I was also very underrepresented in, for what it's worth, right? So I grew up pretty well to do. I grew up in an affluent community. I grew up where my parents had money. I grew up where I was able to have access to certain things that people didn't have access to. And the thing in terms of like the comfort in the sport and the there's got to be like a comfort and a confidence in yourself and an ease with yourself. So especially when you're a person who's a minority and I'm not calling myself a minority. I'm saying like I was truly a minority in the sport. Literally there weren't a lot of people that looked like me in the sport when I played and when I started playing. And I could go multiple games and I was the only black person on the field. And for what it's worth, I could go multiple games and I was the only person of color on the field, let alone the only black person on the field. And so, I think there has to be a kind of like quiet confidence about yourself, knowing that you're different, and in some ways, almost like relishing the fact that you're different, and almost feeling good about being different and being not necessarily like a pioneer, but being okay with being different. So I've always been a person who was very comfortable not needing to fit into any box or not needing to feel like I needed to do something to be like somebody else. Like that's always who I've been, and that's always who I'll be. And so it wasn't hard for me to feel like playing the sport was right because I enjoyed the sport and I enjoyed the competition. I enjoyed running past people. I enjoyed hitting people. I enjoyed scoring on people. I enjoyed stripping people. I enjoyed, the camaraderie with my teammates. I see you. I see you. I enjoyed the camaraderie with my teammates, and I was fortunate in a lot of different teams that I play with, and even still today, I've been very fortunate to play with a lot of great people. Like some of the people that I played with in high school are still incredibly important people and friends in my life today. People that I played in college with, truly, like these people are like brothers right now, and that because like you've met a lot of these people that I've played ball with from high school to college to men's leagues. That people are like brothers to me. So I've been very fortunate where it was no longer about color or race or anything like that. It really became about just the sport. And so all of a sudden, like the boundaries and the lines within the sport were probably like more important and more defining than the boundaries of race or religion or anything else like that. Like what held us in common was, our team. Like that was the unifying factor.
Perfect. And you've always showed signs of resilience through all of these tough things, and I salute you for that. And it's just often that I see when reading about African American history or learning anything new in this class. I just want to end us on just this theme of resilience. So I have this quote: "Each man in his own way, through what he achieved during and after his collegiate career, along with Jack Johnson, the first African American boxer to win the heavyweight title, was an early embodiment of the quote unquote new Negro, a term applied to African Americans who refused to bow down to racist practices and asserted themselves and their beliefs in the face of prejudice in the years following World War One." This is from a Jill DuPont article. So it is just seeing through all the adversity, African Americans have this constant theme of resilience that shines through all the negatives. Um, so, how do you think the resilience of African Americans can be correlated with the trials and tribulations of being in an underrepresented sport such as lacrosse? Um, and when in your career have you seen that same theme of resilience, and how is it correlated to your love of lacrosse?
It's a, it's a long question. It's a long question. Um, so I think the first part is just about how sport in general, like this sport in general, relates to resilience, right?
Um, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Of
So
like being the trials and tribulations of being in a underrepresented sport like lacrosse.
yeah, so I think sport in general does that. So like, let's take sport just alone. Sport in general alone is about this process of like normalizing error, right? So you do something in a sport, you stink at it, and then you're told that you stink at it, and then you got to get better. And if you wish to, you are resilient. You wish to get better, so you practice it, and then you become better at it, right? And so all sport to me is about normalizing error and a part of the feedback loop where it's like the idea is to be the best. The idea is to be great. The idea is not to be a loser, right? Like the idea of sport is to win. And so it is ego driven, but at the same time, it's also about putting aside your ego and being okay and comfortable enough and uncomfortable enough at the same time with failure that it's like, all right, you're willing to put yourself out there, you're willing to fail, but then you don't like failure, and then you want to do it better. And you want to, so the only way to do it better is by practicing. And the only way to do it better is by being very like keenly aware of how you failed. And so, in terms of like resilience and what that is and how it translates to life off of the field, I think that African Americans within the sport of lacrosse, it's it's about access. And so, all of a sudden, if you start to see, for me, it's like all of a sudden, if you start to see more black people playing the sport, to me, it's also saying like, all right, well, finally, we're getting some people with some more access. And at the same time, it still kind of speaks to the fact that there's still not enough. And then there's also like some other things like holding people back from being able to access it or being able to know about it. Like some kids don't even know about it. But you're starting to see more and more, and I teach in the city, so like you're starting to see more and more. Like before, if I brought up something around lacrosse, like some of my kids are like, "What is that?" Like they had no idea. But now I've got kids that I've taught. They're like, "Oh, I play lacrosse," or my cousin plays lacrosse. So it's a beautiful thing in terms of just being able to get access. So what was the second part? The second part of your question was what?
So how have you seen that same theme of resilience, and how is it correlated to your love of lacrosse?
Yeah, so I guess that goes back to even the first part of what I said, right? I think that my love of lacrosse, even like I'm old now, right? Like, the idea or washed, but I guess I'm kind of washed, you know. But I guess it's still about like this love for the game and the the desire to still play, and I don't really even play anymore to be competitive, like I'm not incredibly competitive anymore. Like when I play lacrosse now, it's more about the enjoyment of it and the mindfulness of sport. So for me, um, resilience is about this ability to be completely mindful and not be stuck in anything in the past, not be worried or anxious about anything in the future, but you're like completely present with sport. So for me, lacrosse or any sport for that matter is really just about like this notion of mindfulness in between the lines and being able to just be completely and fully present with what's happening at that point. And I think if more people can apply that to their life, um, people will be a lot more resilient. They're not going to be as anxious. They're not going to be as depressed. It's really just going to be about that moment right then and there, and that's the only thing that actually exists. It's not the worries that had happened. You can't change it. It's not anything that hasn't happened yet. You don't even know that it's going to happen. So you just be present. You be prepared. You be equipped in order to adapt and adjust. And I think that's sport, and I think resilience can exist in a really healthy way that way.
Of course. So I just wanted to, thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
That's a little bit more than our time, but that was perfect. I loved hearing your perspective on everything like that. And do you just have any final thoughts about the topic?
No, I think it's great that you're doing this in general. I think it's great that you're doing it with this particular topic. I think it's a great opportunity for your teacher to create this opportunity for you to even like dig into it and dive into the topic and certainly pick a topic that's important for you. So kudos to you, kudos to your teacher, kudos to all the kids in your class that are kind of doing the work and um, just exploring these different topics. Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, of course. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.